Hello, everybody. I'm John Barnwell here, and I'm here with my good buddy Douglas Gabriel to give us the What is Cosmic Intelligence? This is episode 13, and if you've been following this series, then this will have perhaps a deeper meaning for you than if you haven't been. But you can always go back and listen to the earlier episodes, as it's not dated information specifically, and that it's not dealing with current events. And so it's very, I think, helpful in enabling one to wrap their mind around the over 6,000 lectures of Rudolf Steiner and the over 50 published books and all of that. And so when you look at these things, well, I was talking with James Stewart yesterday, the diligent individual that put together the Rudolf Steiner archive. There's a link for James's work below, several links, but he's since moved on from that to his elib.com publishing venture. And so he's working on getting out Rudolf Steiner lectures that have never been presented in English in a published form. So good luck to him and his wife, Marilyn, on that endeavor. And in any regards, we were discussing, because, he worked on that for 40 years, and I found out about Rudolf Steiner when I was, in junior high, from my good buddy who happened to be standing next to me in the alphabetical line in gym class when he turned to me and said, "Have you ever heard of Rudolf Steiner?" And it rang a bell in my heart, so to speak. And so that's the primal experience for me, at least in this incarnation, a very primal experience. And so one of the most significant events in my life, of course, was meeting Douglas Gabriel, realizing that
I was afraid you were going to say that.
Realizing that we were both attempting to approach this daunting task of trying to comprehend Rudolf Steiner. But James and I were talking, and he told a nice story about that. And I said, well, yeah, I've been at this since junior high, and so I feel like I'm a fairly competent beginner. Yeah. How you doing there, Douglas?
I'm doing great, but I didn't start until I was like 19. So I got a late start, John. It's only been about 50 years now. And I basically, I'm out in the missionary fields. I don't speak German, so all I can ever be is a junior student of anthroposophy. But that's okay. That still, if we pay attention to what Steiner tells us, puts us ahead of most people.
Absolutely. And so, as is the case when we do these podcasts, we at least try to have some brief exchange regarding exactly what aspect of this concept of cosmic intelligence we were going to try to approach. And that's all you can hope to do, because it's such a vast subject. And in a recent podcast with Reverend David, Pastor David, I made reference to one of the most important distinctions that one can make in various schools of thought in the world of the esoteric. There are schools that have a cosmology. They have a doctrine regarding the meaning of time. And then there are other schools that don't approach that subject. And so they can't really give you other than a symbolic relationship to the mysteries of time. You have to unlock it yourself. But if one wants to approach the mysteries of time, there's, of course, the door was kind of knocked open by H.P. Blavatsky with her secret doctrine. And then, of course, there's Rudolf Steiner, which is the most comprehensive, most thorough, and I feel the most accurate. Blavatsky didn't really have an understanding of the esoteric Christian stream. She was more of the Eastern school, which is fine, whatever anybody's got to do. And then there's C.G. Harrison, who was a English self-initiated occultist who wrote a book called Transcendental Universe. And in there, he deals with this sevenfold mystery of time, of which the present Earth on which we dwell is the fourth in the series, in the primary chain of the Mahamanvantara, as it would be called in India. This Earth was preceded by three states of consciousness, as they're also described, but three planetary conditions, beginning on old Saturn, then going into a period of pralaya or rest, then going into old Sun, once again another period of pralaya or rest, and then to old Moon, and then another period of pralaya or rest, and now we have the present Earth. And by the way, the Hopi Indians agree with me that this is the fourth world. And so what we're doing is preparing for the fifth world, the Jupiter evolution, as it's called by Rudolf Steiner. But in understanding this, you have to come to terms with some very, very complex subjects regarding the way in which these things develop. And it's interesting how there's a central role played by the human heart. Douglas, how are you? You're on mute. You're on mute.
I was saying, but not being heard, that we're doing great over here. Today is the first time I'm doing a podcast in this room that we're setting up as a studio. So there's a little echo in here. Sorry about that. But besides that, you giving the challenge again and again to me to try to address the content of Wonders of the World, Trials of the Soul, and Revelations of the Spirit always kept dumbfounding me, because no matter where you go in that lecture series, you're going to be amazed. And I love the three quotes that you sent me that are going to be the theme of today, because it seems to focus on the etheric body, the ethers, and that's critical when it comes to being a Waldorf teacher. When I was a Waldorf teacher, they would say, well, we're teaching the etheric body of the child. And, oh, great. I can't wait. What is that? And they'd talk for about 12 seconds, and then that's it. They couldn't tell you what the etheric body was. And they certainly couldn't tell you what the ethers, some of the component parts that help derive the life processes in the ethers, they couldn't tell you what that was. And they couldn't tell you, if you then ask a question about the elementary kingdoms, are the elementary kingdoms related to the etheric body? Are etheric formative forces the same as the ethers? Where do they come from? How do they originate? So on and so forth. And so finally, after many years of teaching Waldorf teachers and having these questions again and again, I put together a book. Matter of fact, I seldom ever show our books, but I'm not selling them. They're for free if you go to our site, Neo Anthroposophy. I think John has it in the dialogue box below. It's called The Eternal Ethers. Let's see if I can get it not to shine. A Theory of Everything. And this book is thick with all kinds of charts and explanations from the past about what the ethers, which used to be called the tattvas, are, and how they come into modern time. Even all of Einsteinian theory is all based upon the luminiferous ether. If you say that to a scientist, they'll tell you you're nuts. That's because they're nuts. How dare they try to study a subject that they didn't look at the state of the art, look at the past, look at what people have been saying for 10,000 years about the ethers. And now there's hardly a theory out there that is a theory of everything, a TOE, a TOE, theory of everything. There is hardly a single theory of everything out there that doesn't have ether, certain types of the ethers, one or other of the seven ethers, speculation on etheron, speculation on all this stuff. It's all connected to ethers, because there has to be what they would call a fluidic substance that all of this is happening in. We call it emptiness, a vacuum. Others would call that a goddess. In ancient Norse, Finnish, when they had a name for her, she was described as basically the waters. And out of the waters, everything came. That's what the Christians described as the waters. You described just a minute ago Manvantaras, Mahamanvantaras, pralayas in between them. When you're in a pralaya, you're back into the arms of the great goddess mother, a fluid substance that is like the substance inside of a that a cocoon inside of a cocoon, a chrysalis. It's the same kind of fluidic substance that has the capacity to remember what the past was and have the imprint and the design for what the future is. And that's what our DNA is. That's why most of our DNA is not written on. It will be written on in the future. But right now, as we are developing ourselves, we're actually developing our DNA. But to think that the DNA is the etheric, no. Those are all the building blocks, the mechanisms that support the forces and the function and the beings that stand behind these things. And so it's very, very simple and it's very, very complex. But unfortunately, scientists refuse to look in the direction of truth because they're looking in the direction of money and getting their name on their next discovery. Well, your discovery, Mr. Scientist, Mrs. Scientist, has been there for a long, long time. And you're just noticing it. So you shouldn't put your name on it. All right. And the ethers, don't get me started on the ethers. You can't be a Waldorf teacher if you don't know what the ethers are. And you can't be a Waldorf teacher if you don't know what the etheric body is. So then I would say to some of the deepest anthroposophists that I'd meet in the world, all throughout the world, I traveled to meet these people, and I'd say, I want to understand the ethers. I want to understand the etheric body. And they'd usually give me some glib answer like, well, you can either be a Waldorf teacher and watch the etheric body grow from age 7 to 14, where it is demonstrating the whole history of humankind as the child grows into modern times. You're actually watching the child go through those ages. And that's why as a Waldorf teacher, you teach them certain world literature content to meet the needs of the etheric body at that particular stage. And so if you didn't want to be a Waldorf teacher, what would you do? I'd say to them, well, they'd say you can be about an Emma gardener and you can go out into the garden. And over the years, you just watch the ether as it does its thing. And it's like, oh, well, that's not okay, good, but And then Rudolf Steiner tells us, oh, yeah, you can understand the ether body. All you have to do is put yourself through an initiation, a self-initiation where your ether body, consciously, you are conscious of your ether body separating from your physical body. And when that happens, that's one of the stages of initiation. And that's what he described in one of these quotes that you gave us to meditate on before this talk, where he's describing the energy that goes from the heart to the head. In this particular case, like in so many things in that lecture cycle, he only makes a very simple reference to it. And if you're not careful, you'll miss it. You'll actually go blink. You'll go, what did he just say? I don't understand that. It sounds profound, but he didn't elaborate on it. So what I do? So you have to go. And if you want to understand what he said about this energy going from the heart to the head, Karl Koenig, in his book, Earth and Man, give a description of this, and Rudolf Steiner later calls it the etherization of the blood or the earthly and cosmic nutrition stream. Now, in this book, The Eternal Ethers, which you can get for free in a PDF copy, I'm not trying to sell the book, but the information I'd like to give you, and then you can find a complete description of it in relationship to many other religious traditions in this book, the second volume of the Gospel of Sophia, which I helped write with my fantastic wife, Tyla Gabriel. Now, why is that important? Because Rudolf Steiner proved that he was linking up with all of the previous secret teachings in the ancient past, not that ancient, in Buddhism, they have the highest yoga tantra. And what is it? It is literally the etherization of the blood. When you go into the study of the pranayama and the tattvas, what is it? Same thing. When you go into religious experience, even through the Catholic Church and the Holy Eucharist, what is it? Same thing. When you go into studying modern science and the cutting edge of science, what are they describing? Things that happen in the human body, the same exact phenomena. Rudolf Steiner is one of the few who brought it into modern language and showed us exactly the elements you work on, which chakras you work on, why it works. And now, literally, science will tell you that your intelligence is determined by biomineralization, which is this exact process. Etherization of the blood is biomineralization of working with the elements that Rudolf Steiner said are the building blocks that we take all of our nutrition from: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and sulfur, or sometimes phosphorus. It helps the sulfur. So as you go through this process of rarefication and ionizing these elements, you develop what science will call biomineralization: calcium carbonate crystals deposited in your pineal gland, directly related to your IQ. So this process that he refers to in the quotes that you sent me, I forget which of the lectures it was, but all three of the quotes made reference to basically the etheric body. And I don't know, you're going to have to probably cut me off before I stop, absolutely rambling on about the etheric body, because it's the most amazing thing you can possibly ever imagine. And I could go on for days and days and days, and I'm sure I have.
Yes, well, we've had a few subjects, discussions regarding that subject over the years, Douglas, and the understanding of the time stream of the tattvas, the 5 tattvas, and their relative to the rotation of the earth, and that's all incredible mystery. And that's, as you look at the workings of the ethers in outer nature, but when you bring them into the personal realm, and you get into a more imaginative, experiential realm, and then you look at some of the experiences that saints and initiates have had over the ages. One of which I thought was really nice that I wanted to include today is Mathilde of Hackeborn. She's from circa 1241 to 1299, like the very beginning of the German mystic stream in the vernacular language, right? But in her work, she talks about a vision she had, and she said, once upon a time, being in like manner wrapped in spirit, she saw herself, as it were, in a certain house of marvelous beauty, which well she knew was the heart of Christ. And falling on the ground, she found a large cross upon the pavement, and she sank down upon it, and lo, from the middle of the cross there went forth a golden spear and transfixed her. And so there you have that image, and you could live with that. And there's a festival for her in November, and she's an interesting individual because, and Rudolf Steiner makes mention to her because she had a sense of humor, and he's talking about how that was an expression of her humility and her recognition of her humanness. That it was, I mean, you can go into these exalted states and then you go back and then you're just that guy again, So it's not like once you cross the river, you get to live there all the time necessarily. And so it becomes an interesting challenge. And actually, scholars consider her, amongst whom I agree, that she was the guide that Beatrice or Beatrice introduced to Dante in the Divine Comedy regarding the sevenfold mountain, climbing the sevenfold mountain. And she's an interesting individual. Just to think about people like that can be uplifting, especially in the challenging times in which we live, to have somebody who is striving for purity of heart. And so that's the distinction that Rudolf Steiner is getting into, because you see, if you look at the way in which evolution has manifested according to the doctrines of occult science, esoteric Christianity, you see that there's this breathing forth, that the universe was like it was breathed forth. It's in the beginning was the Word, but it's the voiceless word, it's referred to, and the whole image of that, and that the light aspect and the word aspect is a central theme within the mystical presentation of the Gospel of John in the first 14 verses. And so that's a great meditation regarding that, because as it says in Scripture, Jesus is the light of the world. But you have to understand that there's another light. And that's something we want to touch on in order to get some clarity, because there's a complete distinction between the warm, loving light that expresses forth as a spear from the heart of the Christ, and that there's another type of spirit that works in the realm of light, and that's Lucifer. But that's that selfish, self-contained, effulgent light. It's a completely different thing. But Rudolf Steiner says it's because of the actions of the adversaries that mankind has freedom. And so we have the opportunity to be able to abide by the divine plan or go against the divine plan. And that was something that was built into creation, so to speak. And so you have, well, what are these adversarial beings? And he says that there's the divine spiritual outpouring of creation. That's the central task of mankind, and that leads up to the events in the Old Testament. And he refers to Christ as being expressing through Jehovah in the Old Testament. But he also says that with the Jewish transmission, they totally set aside all Luciferic influences whatsoever. So it's very pure in that regard. But then you have the other cultures that were guided by individuals related to that stream. It'd be nice to get into that in more depth. I'd recommend the booklet by Rudolf Steiner. It was one of the few lecture cycles that he went to the trouble to edit it into a book, and that's The Guidance of Mankind, or The Guidance of Humanity. It's sometimes published The Spiritual Guidance of Mankind. There's numerous titles, but it's a short book, and it gives you a really highly developed, encapsulated view of that developmental theme. But so you have that the idea that the divine spiritual beings, though, had this experience of thinking into being spirits to be in opposition to them. And that these adversarial beings are not the same as the divine spiritual beings, and that they're developed out of the thoughts of the divine spiritual beings. And that's a distinction that Rudolf Steiner doesn't make very often.
The spear she was stabbed with, some say, would be the spear of Michael, and that one could say that in our times, we know that the Archangel Michael has risen to become an archai, and sometimes seen with a spear, a sword, and sometimes often with a scale, because he's now become somewhat of a judge. And so he's also the keeper of cosmic wisdom, but he doesn't hand it out without effort on the part of the person receiving it. And so we also then now have an archangel who's leading the other 7 major archangels, and that is the being that has been called Vidar out of the Northern Mysteries. And so we can literally say that in the realm of the astral, etheric, and physical, you can see the battle with the angels, the archangels, and the archai, with Lucifer, Ahriman, and the asuras, who are basically here ahead of time to prepare for the Antichrist Sorat. So this is basically what happens when you try to understand the etheric. First, you're not going to unless you can understand the astral light. The picture behind me, let's see if you can see it, up in the corner is the wolf of Gubbio. And that being with arms is wrapping love around the astrality of the wolf of Gubbio. So that's St. Francis. That was painted by Chuck Andrade, who you know well, John. And it's an original, and it's so beautiful because it reminds me that we're all doing that. If you don't wrestle with the forces of the wolf, the forces of the snake, the forces of evil in your own self, then you won't get past the astral light challenge. And that happens, of course, in the realm of the angels, in the realm of imagination. But it's only if you have tamed the astral light that you will be able to see properly there. First off, just as an example, the way that it works a bit, when we look out upon the world, our nerve system has to adjust for the fact that our eyes tell us that everything's upside down. Everything we see is upside down, folks. You are making an adjustment. You are actually standing on your head. And once you understand that, then you can understand why when you go into dreams, sometimes they're upside down, inside out, and backwards. Well, that's because you're trying to traverse space, time, and consciousness. And when you go into the astral, the etheric, and the physical, that is space, time, and consciousnness. So in the astral light, you're trying to tame space. And that's the reason I think Chuck's painting here, by the way, he's one of the best lasurists in the world. And he's certainly one of the best here in this country. So if you want your rooms painted beautiful, any surface or any kind of art, he's an amazing artist. Look him up, Chuck Andrade. But he does a beautiful job here because he shows that it's really embracing your own evil that you conquer it. So if you don't embrace the astral light and understand that it's basically lying to you, it's all a delusion. And why? Because of what John has made reference to. The fall of Lucifer into matter caused us to be able to see, hear, and feel the world. In other words, the heterochrony of the incarnations of Saturn, Sun, Moon before our incarnation now on Earth. So as we are facing this and we're in the process of initiation, we want to get past the astral. In other words, you have to tame all of your vices and turn them into virtues. And if you don't, well, you'll be wrestling with the wolf of Gubbio for a long time, or a dragon, the Midgard serpent, or Fenris wolf, or all the images they have for it. But if you get past that, then you can get into the etheric. Your ether body is the most amazing thing. What I'm going to tell you sounds like science fiction. Hang on to your hat. Don't believe me. Go to the Rudolf Steiner archives. Thank you, James Stewart in Maryland, for all the sacrifices you have made to make that incredible resource. I say the number one resource in the English-speaking world is the Rudolf Steiner archives. And if you go there and you look up the ether body, you'll find that all this is true. The ether body is born ancient when you're born. Your ether body, your life body, which gives life to your physical body, which is dying, your life body, which is somewhat, you could say, a metaphor, that it's also true, that it's levity, and your physical body is gravity. Well, without that levity, you wouldn't have any life at all. They said the question that Newton asked was incorrect. Not how did the apple fall on my head? How did the apple get up there? That's what Ralph Marinelli used to always say. And I'd say, absolutely, Ralph. It's about levity. So now, Ralph, since you've proven that the heart is not a pump, please prove that levity is a force so that science will start to wake up to the fact that when you're talking about the ethers, warmth and light is levity, sound and life is gravity. And that polarity, male, female, without that, there be no interaction. And what holds it all, that space, is the Akasha. But there are two other ethers I'm not going to talk so much about at this point, but there are 7 ethers. But 2 of the ethers are sound ether and life ether that have not fallen into the earth atmosphere. And that's called the tree of life. That's where we get our future. And we write into our DNA becoming angels and archangels and archai, except we won't have DNA when we're angels. But the point is that it's all there for us to start taking in now. And so if you can get into the etheric, when you're born, it's like silica. When you're born, you're almost all silica. When you're dying and you're really old, you're mostly calcium. And essentially, your etheric body is born ancient and it gets younger all the time. Now, that seems like a strange thing, but it basically is the opposite of what we believe as entropy, gravity, life is all about just trying to resist dying. Well, what if we actually built on the forces of levity, which are very possible? Rudolf Steiner gave indications in those directions. So when you're in the etheric realm, if you got past the astral light, then you probably met an angel and it blinded you. Well, that's just the beginning. I could go into who those beings are, but then when you get into the etheric, you have the capacity, if you can see into the etheric, to see what's happening there now. And there is a battle for the soul and spirit of humanity in the etheric realm, both in the human body and in the physical earth. And that battle is being led by Christ. And Christ is fighting so that the soul of human beings is not endarkened, so that after death, they don't live in a cold, dark grave, but rise up into the light. And every human being that is working to bring the positive levity of ethers into the world, and that's laughter, and that's love, and that's mercy and grace, and all the virtues. If you're bringing that type of light, wisdom, higher harmonic sound, all these different things, the number ether is also the sound ether. So when you're talking about understanding atoms or anything in the physical world, that's the sound ether. But those things were donated in the past. Warmth, light, sound were donated in Saturn, Sun, and Moon. And they are in heterochrony, manifesting your physical, etheric, and astral body. But the fourth round, or the fourth incarnation of the earth itself, gives us our ego, which stands in between. And now we must transform the physical, etheric, and astral into three higher principles. And you do that by starting with the astral. And most people who are psychic, that's as far as they ever get. A tiny touch, their toe goes into the astral. That's about it. How many real psychics get into the etheric and understand the rhythms between one incarnation and another? Very few. And how many people can see into the physical? Almost none. You have to be a great initiate, an avatar, a saint, or be given a gift or a vision or a revelation to truly be able to see the active intuition that is in the wisdom of everything in your physical body. We cannot comprehend it. We cannot comprehend it. If you could comprehend the etheric body, Rudolf Steiner said, if you could enter into your body and understand the etheric body for one single moment, you would die. You would be overwhelmed because it's that powerful. And yet science ignores that it even exists. And the astral body, well, basically, you could say that psychology is beginning to try to understand what the astral body is about. But it's real simple, folks. It's all about purity. And once you have purity, you have a true burning fire that is the one that the alchemists are looking for, the slow burning fire. And what is that? The understanding of time. The etheric body is time. It's the written into it at the moment of your birth is the entire history of all of your relatives back to the beginning. It's in your body. It's teaching you. It has tremendous wisdom. We don't understand that. We don't control our circulatory system, our nerve system. We don't control hardly anything. It's mostly, the sympathetic and autonomic nervous system. We only have a few choices. Our body is ran by other beings from other times. Some would call it dimensions, but they are to a degree, yes, interpenetrating us simultaneously. And without that, we wouldn't have anything. The etheric body is built by the beings of the Karyotetes, the beings of wisdom, the beings who built into the light that we receive, the wisdom that causes a seed to understand, to know what it's going to become, from leaf to stem to blossom to seed and growing again, fall to the earth. How about a human being from birth to death? What is that? That is your etheric body. That's your etheric biography. And believe it or not, everything you're going to ever become is already written into your etheric body. That sounds very strange too. But when you're born as a baby, the reason people Google over babies is they're basically infinite wisdom and purity. It'd be nice to have that for the rest of your life, but we don't. We don't even have any clue to how to find wisdom, let alone be wisdom. So a baby is all intuition. A baby is all will. And that's why we love them so much, right? But when they're born, they aren't conscious. They haven't conquered space or time or consciousness. The spiritual beings that surround them do all that for them. So when you're talking about the etheric body, there's no greater gift than being able to teach a child from age 7 to 14 and watch that ether body grow. And then from 14 to 21, you can watch the astral body grow. And then from there on, the ego is trying to understand what has happened up until that time, basically to age 28. So as a teacher, as a Waldorf teacher, it was my greatest privilege every single day to go in and to witness the growth of these children responding to what Rudolf Steiner gave as what we call in the book Eternal Curriculum. There is another book called Eternal Curriculum, another free book you can have of ours. And it's an eternal curriculum. Why? Because it's teaching all of the past of mankind. Waldorf curriculum, grades 1st through 8th, teaches all the past of mankind, all the way up to the present, and far, far, far into the future. It sounds kind of crazy, but if you look at the book, you'll see that that's why Rudolf Steiner gave such a comprehensive curriculum. It is a picture of the etheric body of the child, which goes from the past to the present to the future. And that's not what anyone will hardly tell you except Rudolf Steiner. Even my Waldorf teachers couldn't tell you that. They'd tell you this. The etheric is rhythm, rituals. It's doing the same thing over and over again. It's somehow connected with numbers, and it's magical, and the ether body is bigger than the physical body, and the ether body of the heart goes all the way from the heart up to the head and all the way up behind the head, and somehow it has something to do with memory and teeth falling out, second intention of the teeth, and that's about all I know, and now I'm going to run away and don't ask me any more questions. That was the answer I was always given.
Yeah. Well, in other words, figure it out. It's interesting because going back to dear Matilda Hackaborn, her symbols were the scales and the sword, a heart, a book, and a dove. So that's kind of an interesting mixture of symbolic images that ties into this theme. And when you get into the scales, that brings to mind for me in the papyrus of Ani from ancient Egypt. And it shows the scale with a heart, the ib, being, it's like a pot on with two things sticking out on it, handles like, and it's being weighed against a feather. And that's like the conscience, but as an external force of the beings of their pantheon, So you're dealing with something that is very different, because conscience, as we know from Rudolf Steiner, hadn't even come into being at that time. Like in ancient Greece, they talk about the being assaulted by the Furies if you violated. So, but in the Papyrus of Ani, it's being weighed against a feather. And you see Thoth, which is like Hermes, and he's taking notation. And behind him, there's this beast waiting, like, if you don't make the cut, you get chewed up by this thing. So it's like interesting, which the feather is the feather of Ma'at, which is truth. But to have the scale represented in Mechthild is very interesting. And there's a good case to make that it was her in Dante because of the timing of when her book became popular in Italy at that time. And so coming out of Florence and that whole milieu. And then you have Dante with his Templar stream coming into this whole meeting of the Hermetic and the esoteric streams that were all mingled in with all of that. And so you have her, as Douglas was referencing, you have the seven deadly sins, that she's key in that understanding, because that is a story in three parts, the Divine Comedy, you know. So you have the Inferno, and then you have Purgatory, and then you have heaven, right? And so she's key at being at the top of coming to terms with those mysteries of the purgatorial mysteries, which is climbing that mountain of the seven deadly sins. And so you have that idea that your astral nature, your desire nature, is always struggling with your etheric body, okay? And that's why you get, at the end of the day, you get tired. It's all this rattling around that your astral nature is doing. It's wearing out your etheric body. So you got to go back to sleep, and then the ego and the astral body take off, and the etheric body and the physical body can regenerate. And you look at somebody sleeping, they have that kind of docile visage, so to speak, like a plant, you know, if they're sleeping soundly, you know, that's all that's going on there is etheric and physical, that the astral and the ego are off in other places. But there is that experience that you could see described by certain mystics, and although they may be struggling to find the words, just because of certain signposts in their visions, you know that they're a genuine mystic if you've studied these things for any length of time. And so you see that they can come into an experience within the realm of the heart to where there's a separation of the etheric body from the heart that brings one into an experience of light. And that's the movement of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and all of that development that came really strongly with Bernard of Clairvaux, of course. He was the one who wrote the rules for the Order of the Knights Templar. And so you have this whole idea of that sacred mystery of the Divine Sophia, all wrapped up in this whole idea of the Divine Feminine, and that you have the two wholesome counterparts of the Divine Feminine and the Christ, and then you have the like image or mirror image, the enantiomorphic pairing of that is your adversaries, that they're like a counter image of the reality of the divine spiritual intentions. And so what can we do to align ourselves with the divine spiritual intentions and yet not sacrifice our freedom? And so that's the challenge, and that's the intent why we have this opposition, so that we can come to free decisions. And that's an important thing to grasp. And so for myself personally, I'm not particularly nationalistic, but I do believe in freedom. And so I'm going to be supportive of things that will enable that free impulse, that Michaelic impulse to stream forth. Just to give an example, see that you can align yourself with universally human ideas and approaches to the world without succumbing to the lower, shadowy aspects of it that just lead to conflict.
I love the image there, you know, with the sword and the spear and the book and the scales. That also reminds me of Manjushri in Tibetan Buddhism. It reminds me of an image that Steiner gave, but first I'd like to say I believe that in my way of looking at it, we are all in the war in heaven, and we are particularly the Archangel Michael. And anything below your heart was supposed to have been developed in the past. Your relationships with others, you're supposed to know that your blood and your relations aren't even as strong as your spiritual connections. You're supposed to have resolved anything with your relations. And then you're also supposed to have resolved what you eat and drink, how you create energy in your body. And you're supposed to have resolved your sexuality and your foundation. Those are the chakras below your heart. So those are joined together as a dragon, the image of all animals. That's what a dragon is. It's the zodiac. It's the all animals put into one animal. And we don't kill the dragon. We hold it at bay. And the reason that the scales are there is to use the energy of the dragon and have the scales to know the equilibrium of what we can use and what we cannot use from those lower realms. In other words, there's energy from the lower realms that give us also virtues, but can lead us to vices. So we are in that battle. We're in the war in heaven every single day. And if we can go from our heart to our head, well, this is what Rudolf Steiner describes. He says it's a quest of the Holy Grail. He says you start in the heart and you start off really as dull and uninitiated, and you go through these 3 steps. First off, breathing properly with oxygen, right? I mean, you have to enter into what you know as your interaction with the outside world. That's the breathing process. That's oxygen. Then you go into the speech and hearing, and you have to figure out the language of the people around you, the language of the spirit, the language of your own self. And that is, in fact, nitrogen. And it's a transformation of nitrogen. And then you go into the third eye, which is hydrogen, and later to sulfur to the crown chakra. So as we're going through these, we are on the Holy Grail quest. We're trying to refine ourselves, refine every breath that we take, every thought that we have, every feeling, every action. And if we get up to where Rudolf Steiner said, now remember, it all depends upon your perspective. So at one point, Rudolf Steiner said, the Holy Grail can be found in the midbrain of the human head, and that the human head is the oldest and most fixed of all parts of the body. It represents the entire cosmos, the entire zodiacal stellar world, and in it are these perfected ventricles. And he literally says, if you look at the cerebellum, you are looking at the perfection of all animals, all insects, all birds, all things that were on the earth and down here before humans. And when we came down, we got the cerebellum. Cut it in half, it looks like a perfect tree with 12 branches on each side. Rudolf Steiner actually says that in physiology, in the neurological system, it represents the tree of life. Well, holy moly. Not in very few stories give you a chance to get the tree of life. So, of course, I studied that thoroughly and found that I believe that the tree of knowledge is in, of course, the midbrain and the 4th ventricle, and that is where the pineal gland sends piezoelectric energy across the fluid in the 4th ventricle, and it stimulates the pituitary gland. So Steiner says you go up as your sword. You're building your sword or spear, either one he says, and you go up to the head, and this is the biomineralization I'm talking about. This is the etherization of the blood. Then you turn around, and if you have, as you just said, the feather of Mott. By the way, what animal is that feather taken from? Do you know? I've been wondering about that.
Yeah, it's generally considered to be an ostrich tail.
That's what I thought. Exactly. And so you weigh yourself against truth. And truth is the only thing that lasts. It's the only thing that's eternal, and the virtues. And you take them and you offer them to the spiritual world. And right there in that glowing cup, he calls it, and Manly P. Hall gives a beautiful description of it. Many, many, many of the traditions describe this astounding, inexhaustible chalice that is found in the midbrain. And that literally, what is it doing? It's taking light that comes through the nerves, sound that comes through your spinal column, up through the midbrain, and sounds in this fluid. Rudolf Steiner talks about the sounding of your heart, the sounding of your will, your metabolism going into the midbrain. And there, in a way, it's offered up to the spiritual world with all of your higher thinking, which is light, all of your higher feeling, which is sound, and your actions are what causes that piezoelectric charge. It goes across, and at that point, in the Holy Grail, in the Grail Castle, you as the Grail Knight are supposed to ask a question if you get there. And if you don't ask the question, you don't get the next part. If that charge goes across that, and by the way, these are physiological conditions for soul and spiritual manifestations. So as I'm explaining these things, these are all just physical aspects of it. They aren't the true soul and spiritual qualities that one would need to get a full picture of this. But anyway, when that charge goes across and it strikes the pituitary gland, which is at the forebrain, it causes it to excrete pituitrin. And pituitrin is one of the most magical substances. It's a hormone in the body. It basically gives super strength and life to your nerves and your vascular system. And so you take the gifts up as the Grail Knight, you go into the Grail Castle, you see the spear, and you see the drops of blood. We could go into what all those are. Those come from the first and second ventricle, the drops of blood coming from the spearhead. And your inexhaustible chalice, your Grail is there. And it literally then gives you the nourishment you need, called Amrita, Soma, Dew of Heaven, Pituitrin, call it whatever you want. It is the gift of the divine spiritual world, answering whether you have imagination, inspiration, intuition as gifts to them. If you feed them, they feed you. And then they do what? They feed the systems that create your imagination, inspiration, and intuition. They feed your system of sight, of sound, and of action, thinking, feeling, and willing. So this process then goes back down, but when it goes back down, this is the strange part. You take your spear or your sword and you stab your heart. And you must make your heart bleed. And then that blood becomes what Steiner calls the front spinal column, which we now know, and I put in all the books, it's the vagus nerve. It's one of the 12 cranial nerves. It's the most important one. It goes down below your heart to everything down there, brings up a signal, two signals, left and right, and it's what's called the Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. It's not your spinal cord that they're talking about. They're talking about, well, they have many names for it, but Centimani tree, all kinds of things. But this tree that goes from your heart to your head actually starts down in your metabolic system, as I said. It comes up, and that's if you've tamed the dragon. And then it goes right through your sinoatrial node, which causes the pulse, the pacemaking effect of your heart. One of the two branches of the vagus nerve goes right through there, which is the most incredible sensing device, moral and otherwise, in your body, is right there on the sinoatrial node, and it then goes all the way up to your brain and feeds the corpus quadrigemini and your pineal gland, and it actually brings these charges up. And people don't know this, but there's an aqueduct. Your pineal gland usually lies down. Only when the aqueduct flows from the lower ventricle to the midbrain ventricle, the pineal stands up, and then it can flow. Until that time, it's not flowing. And if you don't have flow, you don't have what we describe in the book as a plasma generator. There's a plasma generator in the brain. There's one in the heart. Now, John pointed out from the beginning, it's all about the heart. That's what it's about. Your heart is a cube, not because your heart is shaped like a cube. Your heart is surrounded by these organs that create a cube around your heart. And that's how it acts in that. And it's moving inside of a cube. In the future, it's called the green kutab by the Sufis, the inexhaustible chalice by the Christians, especially the Eastern Orthodox religions. But we call it, of course, a Platonic solid because why? As scientists, we would say, you inside of your consciousness, your mind, where you have your consciousness is not your brain. That's where your thoughts are reflected. But inside of your heart, that's your consciousness. And what do you have in your consciousness? You have forward, backward, left, right, up, and down. And you're in the middle. That's who you are, according to scientists. That's about it. That's all. They give you that in the five senses, a little bit of the five senses. That's it. So you're in a cube, and you're locked in this cube. And Rudolf Steiner says that if you go inside of yourself, you will come to a stone that is so hard that nothing can break it. It is unbreakable. And the harder you try to penetrate into it as a mystic, into your own heart, you will reach a stone. And it will, what is the Grail? It's a stone. It fell from heaven. So did you. And you dive down in this process, and you have to stab that heart with your spear to make it bleed, because then the blood of Christ that has been given in your etheric body, one drop of the etherized blood of Christ, has been given to every single human upon their birth. And if you open your heart with the spear or the sword, it can start to flow upward in this process in the frontal spinal column that I described, transforming things, because it's an ionization process. Rudolf Steiner calls the etherization of the blood a holding back of carbon and turning it into higher carbon through an ionization process. And as John knows, I would love to talk about C60, because that tells us where we're headed in the future, because that's carbon in a higher spiritual form, come from space, by the way. And so we will change ourselves in the future into carbon that is like a fluid diamond, completely transparent. And that is the ether body. And it's round. And it's right now looks kind of the color of peach if you're a high pure person. But in general, in the future, it's going to be transparent. And you will receive the higher ethers from the higher sound and higher life ether directly from the sun, and it will nourish the true ether body, which right now is basically living in the shadow of the sun. We are, our atmosphere is basically like holding an umbrella and putting us in the shadow of the sun. But if we got full sun, even with our sunlight, we would go blind. If we got the full warmth of the sun, we would burn up. If we got the full spiritual impulse of the sun, we would die, and we'd either, you could turn into angels, archangels, and archai if you understood what the sun is trying to give us. And that would be given to us by the beings between here and the sun, the beings of Venus, Mercury, and Vulcan, the super beings that are trying to help us evolve. And those are a picture of what our own future etheric body will turn us into. So you shouldn't have brought up this topic, John, if you didn't want me to get completely way out there. But I'm not just spouting. I have the books. I have the proof. I have Steiner's quotes. I have everybody's quotes demonstrating that what I'm telling you is true, even though it may be shocking.
Yeah, just to clarify, when you asked me about the feather on the scales, it's a vulture feather. And some of the earlier authors mistook it to be an ostrich feather. And
yeah, that's what I had thought it was.
The feather of the vulture, Ma'at, which is the goddess of truth. And so that's the mystery of the weighing the heart with the feather. And so you have the crown of Ma'at, where you see that they have the scarab, which is like the sun scarab, right? Kephra. And then you have below that a circle with a line, the symbol of life. And then you have the two wings that go out, and that they're the wings of the vulture. And it has to do with that whole idea of that finality, that there's an end to this thing, that the way you're doing it right now, that you will end up, it's like the dance of death, and became popular in the Middle Ages, where they have pictures of all the people, and it didn't matter what they were, kings, princes, peasants, whatever, and they're dancing with death. They're all going to eventually leave, right? So you're going to be out of here, and then you go do something else. But in getting into some of the images that you were presenting, it goes back to that quote of Mechthild of Hackeborn, because she says, as she saw herself, as it were, in a certain house of marvelous beauty, which she well knew was the heart of Christ. So you have that whole idea. It's like that cube you're talking about with the heart, that there's something that we've been given, that is the donation from the divine spiritual beings, that is very sacred, that we have. And our relationship to that, in the one way, could be described as Kyrios. And Kyrios is often translated as Lord in translations of Scripture. But Rudolf Steiner says, well, that could make you misunderstand what's being implied here, because you see your conscious being is like those adversarial beings in that it's a counter image of the reality. If you get into the unconscious aspects of your being, that's where the divine spiritual beings are to be found. And of course, we're not ready to go there, because were we to go there right now, like Douglas said, without preparation, it would just it would lift you away. You wouldn't be able to withstand that kind of an impulse. But so you see in the descriptions of, like, for example, with saints and all of that, Rudolf Steiner clarifies, he says, well, that there's this astral etheric stream that streams up from the heart, but that there's a weaving together of two different aspects of the astral that forms like this kind of like veil over your head. Yes. And he said that's what's being depicted in headdresses, and when you see like Mother Mary, and she has her blue stole over her head, and then you have like Mary Magdalene has one of gold, and that's a reference to that whole idea of the supersensible aspect of the workings of the astral etheric within somebody who's developed that they develop their aura, and there's a radiance that can be seen. Actually, I won't mention his name, but I had a friend who used to come into the bookstore, and there are times when I would see his aura coming through the glass into the store, and then he'd walk in, and it was like I already knew he was coming in because I saw these purple shimmering sparkles coming through the door before he walked in the room, and he'd be in the middle of this ongoing meditation that he was doing. But so it's something that to me and to Douglas is, these are realities that we're trying to solve, experiences that we've had. There, I realize there are people out there, they haven't had those experiences, or if they did, they didn't notice it. And that's the challenge, because a great many things happen and one doesn't notice that it happened. And Rudolf Steiner makes the distinction about one of the big differences between us today and the people of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and in that, if we have, like, people will describe an experience that happened that was like a super sensible type thing that happened, angelic apparition, what have you, that they think of it as an intervention from the spiritual world. But he said the ancient Greeks, no, they'd see the spiritual world at all, that it's working at all times. It isn't just coming in and out of your life, so to speak, that it's there. It's just that you're not aware of it. You're caught up in looking at the mirror image that is our representation of the world, rather than seeing the world itself as it's manifest through these divine spiritual beings. So that when one aligns oneself with that, and this frontal spiritual column that was first mentioned, that I can think of in its clearest sense, by Blavatsky. Percival mentions it, Harold Percival, and Rudolf Steiner is the one who goes the most in depth regarding that. But it's having to do with this frontal stream and bathing the pineal and pituitary, and with the warmth of speech, and that your higher aspirations build this, but yet the improper relationship to those dragon forces from below, the counter image of those lower aspects, that can muddy the pond, so to speak. And you get people that are very devious and all of that. And Rudolf Steiner says that when you lie, there's something in the world that dies. It's like ink coming into your aura, so to speak. And so when you look at the world we're living now, and there's so much falsehood going on, and there's people squirting ink all over the place, because there's nothing in the world that is a true, somewhat image of what their words are. Their words are not connecting, and that's why I like music, because instrumental music, because it's it is what it is. There's no mistaken through some kind of theoretical opinion about what you thought the guy was saying. It's music, right? And its most profound aspect is the space between the notes.
Of course, music is the etheric body. It's the sound ether, chemical ether, the valence ether, the number ether. And of course, you're a great blues guitar player. So, you know all about music, and you understand that music, it has to do with speech, the word which you made reference to before. And as we unlock those mysteries, as literally we go up and, as you said, bathe the brain with warmth of your speech, with morality in that warmth, that can then cause the Grail castle appear to do what it's supposed to do. Well, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to take over for the old Grail king, but we're supposed to go back down to the heart. Now, the big question, which you made reference to earlier, and we didn't go there because it's such a big question and it can cause so much confusion. But the question is simply, who is on the throne in your heart? Simple as that. And anytime you meet somebody, the first thing they witness is who's on the throne of your heart. They don't care about your head, because there's too many science facts out there, too much knowledge. Knowledge doesn't mean anything. Knowledge means nothing now. Matter of fact, it's the post-truth age. Most knowledge is probably more than 50% of knowledge are all lies. So what do you look at when you see a person? You look in their heart, and you see that immediately. That's their mind. That's what drives them. That's who they put on the throne. And Steiner said, you can put Christ on the throne in your heart, but you can also, he makes reference to, you can put Lucifer on that throne. And I'm going to make reference to, you can put Ahriman on that throne. So when I look at somebody, I can tell whether they're too excarnated, whether they're just too flighty, too airy-fairy, and they're just not incarnated, and they're not going to follow through in what they say, and the words don't mean anything to them. Or they might be so into, they're looking at you and they're thinking, what can I get from this person? That's Ahriman. Or they're thinking mean thoughts. He has something I want. Jealousy, lust, greed, all that stuff. Gluttony. I want what he's eating. And all of that's written right into your heart. And you put those beings, and sometimes you have Lucifer there for a minute and then Ahriman there for a minute. But Lucifer and Ahriman can't see Christ. And they constantly work together. And they refuse to acknowledge that there's a choice. And the choice is freedom and love. And that's in the middle, that's Christ. So if Christ is not on the throne of your heart, everyone sees that. And that's who you are. And so when you approach the spiritual world, if you want to see the astral and go read the astral, if you want to go into the etheric and read it, or into the physical and actually read it, those are stages of initiation that you're not going to go through unless you follow the initiation of Christ. So unless you're willing to sacrifice yourself, to suffer, to forgive, to bless, to endure, to conquer space, time, and consciousness, then you're not really, really ready to put Christ on the throne of your heart. Because when you do, you'll find that the blood that Christ has given you, that one drop of etheric blood of Christ, multiplies every single time you take an action where you have said, not I, but Christ in me. Every time you are acting for the divine, according to Tibetan Buddhism and ancient Indian wisdom, you deposit a little pink drop in your heart. And when a clairvoyant comes up on a person, they can look in their heart and see how many pink drops are there. And they can look into their pineal gland and see if there's any calcium carbonate there, and know whether they're dealing with an intelligent person or an idiot, a moral person or an immoral person, instantaneously. And then you know what they're going to do is going to be one thing or the other. And so everything you are, you're writing it directly into your astral body. And a psychic can read that, and you look like an animal with all of your unresolved passions. Everything in your etheric body, in other words, all the things you do ritually, all the spiritual things, all the sacramental things, all your meditation, all your prayer, are the rhythmic things that you do that make you into a higher person on the path of ascension. That can be seen right immediately in your heart. And then it's almost impossible really for a psychic to read somebody's metabolic system. But if they do, they know who they were in previous incarnations. and they're the patterns that they brought over and the impulses that create the rhythms of their life that they do from one life to the next. John's been a person, well, let me put it this way. I've been a card reader for a long time. And it is amazing how it's so easy it is to say to people, well, you're working on this now. And you know in your mind, and you were working on it in your previous incarnation, and the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that. That's who we are. We have rhythms that we can't overcome. We have astral impulses that rule us. And until we can take care of those astral impulses, you're not going to get to creating healthy rhythms that actually build up the spiritual part of you, that make your etheric body into a spiritual edifice. We've spoken of this before. When we have true wisdom and love, and we combine them, we build a spiritual edifice for the future. It's basically our future body. And that is, again, imprinted in the etheric body. So we could go into the descriptions that Steiner has given of what we're going to look like in the future, but you wouldn't believe us. But it's true, and it makes sense, and it's logical, and it's in all the paths, and we've seen it in art, and we've seen it in the expression of religious sentiment and religious ideas since the beginning of writing or images. So try to understand the etheric, but realize that it's going to take you a very long time to do so. But if you want to really understand the etheric, begin to do things in a rhythmic way. Say your prayers at the same time, eat the same food at the same time every day, do the same things, take your walk at the same time every day, observe the same things at the same time each day, and you actually build spiritual organs. And these are etheric organs, supersensible spiritual organs. And they then become sensitive to what John had as the quotes that we were working on for this, the etheric streams in the body. There's an etheric stream that goes from the head to the left foot, to the right hand, to the left hand, to the right foot, back to the head. And it's going all the time. And most people are sick because that stream has been interrupted. There are streams that come up at one time of the day and go down at another time of the day. There are rhythms of sleep and waking. And in your dream, there's multiple rhythms going on in your dreams. There's rhythms going on every day. There's rhythms going on in your thinking. If you become sensitive to these rhythms and they repeat themselves over and over again, that is an indication that they may have a spiritual origin. And once you understand that, you start to understand the language of the spirit. And pretty soon, once you tame that dragon, you can start to listen to the language of the spirit.
Yes, it's a process of clarification, like the Dalai Lama said to Douglas and I and our friends when he had first come to America, and we were amongst the very first people to meet him. He said, more important than being smart, being clear. And so it's this clarity, because you look at it, you go, geez, am I not going to get to heaven if I don't know all this stuff? Well, no, it just helps you understand what's going on when you get there. You could be the simplest of souls and have these experiences, but yet have the hardest time trying to understand or communicate what happened to you. But in lecture 9 of Wonders of the World, Rudolf Steiner encapsulates this very, very clearly. He says, and I quote, "Yesterday I had to point out how a kind of reversal of the forces which led to a densification of the body is taking place in the human organization. As an example of this, I drew attention to a kind of etherization of the coarser physical substance of the blood, which emanates all the time from our system of heart and blood circulation, with the result that the finest elements of the blood are passing over all the time into the same substance as that which the human ether body consists. And we have seen that these etheric elements stream upwards from the heart in quite distinct currents and permeate the brain. We have seen further that it is in fact because this newly formed element of our etheric body streams through the brain that we are able to develop knowledge which goes beyond the completely egotistic knowledge of what takes place within our own organization. I tried to make it clear that unless these etheric streams were to rise up from the heart to the brain, only ideas, concepts, feelings connected with our own bodily organization could find expression through the instrument of the brain. So that's about as clear as you get. So this is what we're doing. It's this process of clarification. And so in working towards this, the processes of contemplation, meditation, fasting, prayer, all of these are devices that you can work with that can help to provide you with the clarity to be able to approach these studies and the subject involved. But in getting closer to it, that's why it's easier for most people to approach it from the artistic realm, because it's not necessarily that easy grappling with the concepts, but yet one should strive to learn this Christ language because it gives you a means to develop a cosmology so that this can have meaning for you on a deeper level. And thank God that we have the 5,000-6,000 lectures or so of Rudolf Steiner's with complete internal consistency, by the way. And I'd like people that think that this is just something he made up, I'd like them to explain to me how he maintained in complete internal consistency over so many lectures. And by the way, he very rarely worked. He might have a little card with like 3 dates on it and somebody's name. And that was his reference for giving an hour lecture, so this is something exceedingly profound, but it's given in the spirit of complete freedom. Anybody do whatever you think is right for you, of course. But that being said, that Christ wants us to come to him out of perfect freedom. It's not enough that we're compelled to work in the service of Christ, but that we find it in our hearts, that it's the thing to do. And in this spirit, the reference in a lecture that Aaron Pfeiffer, the founder of biodynamic gardening, and the origination of my first book and the diagrams in the back began with the handwritten and watercolored diagrams of Aaron Pfeiffer with his laying out the cosmology of Rudolf Steiner, but that Pfeiffer talked about in Johannine Christianity. It's a good practice to every day do something that benefits somebody that you don't know, that you don't get any personal benefit from. And you can plant seeds of that particular Johannine understanding of Christianity, of that universally human mystery.
Well, the mysteries of the ethers, if you understand them, you'll understand all of creation, what's happening now, and what's going to happen in the future. And that's a huge thing to say. It's a gigantic claim to make. But if you're going to have a theory of everything, then it needs to be comprehensive. And the beauty of it is, the further back in history you go, the more comprehensive they were. They not only told you where it came from and what it is, but where it's going. And so there are many, 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 many predictions out of spiritual works that one can take and advance, and then take spiritual science, investigate them, see how they relate to the modern world, which was the injunction Steiner always gave us. Take anything he says and see if it is applicable in the physical world. See if you can do something with it. And that's what we're trying to do here with the question of the etheric. You can't just go be a Waldorf teacher. You can't necessarily go be a biodynamic gardener, but you certainly can work on your own etheric body. And one of the key factors is your memory. And it isn't, as John just pointed out, that you're not going to get into heaven because you didn't read all the lecture cycles of Rudolf Steiner. No, that isn't the way it's going to work. It isn't even whether you remember it. It's whether or not it meant anything to you and in some way made your life qualitatively better and better for all those around you. So that's what we're trying to do here. And using Rudolf Steiner is such an easy way out. I mean, I must admit, I'm taking the easy path. I read Steiner. I assume that he's probably right. Check it out if I can. Compare it to what I've learned in the past. and what I'm learning in the present, tie it to the present and find out that, oh my gosh, every time he opened his mouth, he was so far, he was 100 years ahead of his time. Well, that takes him into the, into 2025 or so. He's going to already tell us everything that happened in between the time he died and then he told us what's going to happen after that, which is really exciting, because when the etheric world opens up, it's the second coming of Christ. When we all start to use our etheric vision, what he called intellectual clairvoyance, instead of using our old natural clairvoyance, or using no clairvoyance at all, called materialism, when we use these supersensible organs, we can then experience the second coming of Christ, which then re-enlivens our own etheric body. It's kind of like taking a walk in the sequoia forest. They seem to be eternal. So Christ's love is eternal, and it seems to be ever present and won't go away. And so if we can then tap into that etheric, just like when you go to the sequoia forest, the etheric energy, as Steiner describes, between tree to tree, actually creates a continuum. It creates a space that is in the etheric. And that's the reason that we've spent so many years in the forests here in America, and traveling to beautiful places where the etheric energy is so powerful. That helps too, but that is no replacement for rhythmic spiritual action, meditation, reviewing your day, as Steiner calls it, the Rukshau, reviewing your life, reflecting upon your karma, reflecting upon how you affect other people. In that memory capacity that is given to us by Christ, one of the new gifts of Christ, we can find the way to transform the etheric in our side of ourselves into the beautiful redeemed etheric that Christ is manifesting in his second coming in the etheric realm around the earth.
Yes. And I see we're getting on here in time, and I know how busy Sir Douglas is, and I want to make sure that I touch upon a few things that I do, and trying to find the easiest way to get there. But so go ahead and talk. Let me dig something up, will you?
Oh, me? John, how will I ever fill empty space? Matter of fact, when we were on the radio years ago, it was so funny. I became noted for, nobody asked my name until right ahead of time when I'd go on shows, and I'd just give them any fake name, give them any fake job, and then just be an expert in it. That's what television is, It's just all fake. And I've been on some of the big shows, big talk shows, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't matter. You can tell all the lies you want, because that's where we live now. We live in Liveville. But if you get to truth, truth will give you a beautiful rain of light that is called the dew of heaven at the moments that you can attain your direct intuition of truth, because truth and intuition are the same. And as Steiner says in the Philosophy of Freedom, they both alight as love. Intuition is love. That's why it's always correct. And it's always correct for the divine. It may not be correct for you, but it's correct for the absolute, maybe not the relative.
Yes, excellent. That's a good thing I couldn't find what I was looking for. You got to say that. I always like to be thankful here for people that help keep this moving along. And this podcast has been made possible by the generous support of Tyla, of course, and Vadim and Vivian and Tim and Neil and Christian and Mark and Maud and Drubma and Laura and Paul and Rick and Michael, Beth, and oh geez, there's getting to be so many. I have to move the thing over. And Anil and Fred and Ishtar and Anna and Russell and Mike, Ray, Whitney, and so many others over the years. So I really want to thank you all so much. And but that being said, also, if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, you can go to paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And but I have my books, my two books, my first book, which is currently out of print, by the way, but I'm working on rectifying that. That's the Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail. as study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And it has a foreword by Douglas Gabriel here, and it is starting from the foundation of the diagrams of Ehrenford Pfeiffer that I referenced earlier. And I also included those in my second volume, which is still available. You can get it on eBay, or if you're outside the US, you can contact me directly through the academia link listed below on YouTube, or a private message on Facebook. But the Grail diagrams, as I call them, I added a great many more for the second volume that has a foreword by the noted astronomer and psychologist William Bento, good old Willie. And there you have keys to understand the cosmology of Rudolf Steiner's work. And that's really a healthy way to be able to come into relationship to these mysteries. And so you can get those, like I said, on eBay or through the other ways I mentioned. And of course, Tyla and Douglas books are listed there. Tyla and Douglas Gabriel's bookshelf. I have a URL below that you can click on to get you there. And for their websites, the Neo-Anthroposophy and the Gospel of Sophia. And they post daily on Gab as Gabriel's Horn. And you can go to Amazon and you can download free PDFs. And so they really have an incredible number of resources available to help anybody who's searching within this domain or in the domain of more contemporary events and how they've developed in the world of realpolitik, so to speak. And so I just, I'm always happy. I'm sorry it took Douglas and I so long to get to our next episode. We just got caught up, I guess. That's the way summer is. You get totally absorbed in the life of the senses, and it's actually a form of sleep, but it's a good feeling. The weather's been nice. And click like and also subscribe to this channel for further installments. And if there's anything that I left out, Douglas, please let.
Just to thank you for creating the platform for these conversations, which are greater than gold, greater than light. These conversations can give a person a chance to find out who they are, and we are so thrilled to participate in them.
I got, oh, okay. So that was the mystery of the unspoken word. Yeah, and thank you so much. And I want to thank Tyla, your partner there. She's one of the most industrious people I know, and all the work you guys have done with American Intelligence Media and working with Michael McKibben and Americans for Innovation. There's links below for their work in that domain. And so that's we've got a whole panoply of things to keep people busy. And I hope that people can keep their head above and stay clear in these challenging times. Thank you so much.